We are also broadcasting this on Zoom for members at home. So if you would please use your microphone so they can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Gerald Neal, and I serve in the state Senate, Kentucky State Senate, and I represent the 33rd District. That's in Louisville, Kentucky, and it covers multiple neighborhoods, and it's a very diverse neighborhood, which includes the downtown area and major health facilities, et cetera. So welcome. Democrat.
Good afternoon. I am State Representative Katura Heron, and I represent 42nd District, which is also in Louisville. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm State Representative Lindsay Burke. I serve the 75th House District, which is Central Lexington, our second largest city. I'm so looking forward to hearing from you today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Representative Sarah Stalker. I represent the 34th House District, and I'm also based in Louisville.
Good afternoon. I'm State Representative Daniel Grossberg. I represent the heart of Jefferson County, which is the city of Louisville, and I am a freshman, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm a Democrat.
I'm Representative Richard White. I'm 99th District. I'm from Moorhead, Kentucky, in the eastern part. Thank you.
I'm Representative Robert Duvall from Bowling Green. Thank you for being here today.
I'm Representative Derek Graham, State Representative from Frankfort. So welcome to our community of Frankfort and our county. I represent most of the county, and this is my 21st year, but I'm glad to be here today, and I'm glad to have you to come to visit not only the capital city, but my city, hometown.
Greetings. I'm Beverly Chester Burton, representing the 44th District in Jefferson County, parts of South Louisville and Shively. Thank you for being here.
Anybody else at home? Chad, you there?
Hi, I'm Joanna Decker. I'm Chief Policy Advisor for the House Democratic Caucus.
I'm Susan Klimchek. I'm Chief of Staff for the House Democratic Caucus. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie Cantor. I'm the General Counsel for the House Democrats.
Thank you all so much. And thank you very much to our Republican friends. I promise you I invited everyone. So thank you for being brave enough to show up today. This is meant to be an amazing and bipartisan conversation and just an opportunity for us all to learn from the two of you about how we can better work together and better compromise and better serve our constituents. And I will turn it over now to Jillian Youngblood from Civic Genius, who I had the great fortune of meeting this summer and who has made this day possible for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Representative Roberts, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. My name is Jillian Youngblood. I am the Executive Director of Civic Genius. We are a national nonpartisan civic engagement organization working to overcome political polarization. It's going great, as you know. We started working with our colleagues here at Beyond Conflict, I guess about a year ago. The core of our work at Civic Genius is bringing together people from across the political spectrum in local communities. We actually do quite a lot of work in Lexington to solve specific policy problems. And we know that if you are at a town hall or you're in one of many public forums, you do not necessarily hear all of the consensus that exists among your constituents. You often hear from the loudest voices. It can make it very difficult to discuss an issue in nuance, to find consensus that is sufficient for everyone involved. And what we're trying to do is create a forum where people can do that. And we spend a lot of time organizing in the communities where we do work, often 6 months to a year, to make sure that we have really strong representation in terms of ideology, race, income, education, everything else, that we've got a group of people deliberating who are truly representative of the community. And what we found in doing this work is that even people who really want to be engaged don't really believe that it's possible to reach that kind of sufficient consensus that we need to make our government and our politics work. And we realized that we needed a model. People need some kind of demonstration that this can actually happen. And that's how we started working with Beyond Conflict. And I'll let my colleague, Tim Phillips, introduce himself and introduce our guests. But maybe, Tim, you could talk a little bit about the work that you've done around the world and why our Rolf and Mohammed are here with us today.
Thank you. Here we go. I'll make this quick because really I would love for you to have a conversation with Rolf and Mohammed. So I, from the Northeast, from Boston, and 32 years ago, I had the pleasure and honor of founding a nonprofit called Beyond Conflict, had a different name then, but it was very much built on the model of shared experience, meaning in a very, what I like to think, humble way, that people can learn from the experience of others who have found a way to cross profound divides to imagine a different future for their country, anchored in the values of democracy, cooperation, and recognizing that in shared societies, you can only address the shared problems together. And it started at the end of the Cold War in Eastern Europe and the transition from dictatorship to democracy. And then with all the transitions that were happening, the ending of apartheid in South Africa, the ending of the conflict in Northern Ireland, the unfortunate disintegration of Yugoslavia and many other places, we worked with the model of bringing together people like Rolf and Mohammed, who never imagined they could sit across the same table to make peace and make change. And I like to think it's like a big support group on Wales, because they're the last people to come in and lecture and tell you this is the way forward, because they've been in that position. So to Rolf and Mohammed, Rolf to my right, and we're very good friends, so I can say this very honestly. Rolf came from a deeply conservative Afrikaner family and tradition. In college, he was the head of the Afrikaner youth movement, and rose in parliament and politics. He was Minister of Defense, Vice Minister of Interior in charge of the police, and then was instrumental in helping, move the National Party to negotiations to end apartheid. And he'll tell you a bit of his story. And he would often say that I grew up as both a beneficiary and a defender of this system. And I came to realize that the court was morally corrupt. And it was as much corruptive of my community as it is for the nation and the people across those divides. And Rolf and many other South Africans have worked with me and others in places like Northern Ireland and the Balkans, in the Middle East and elsewhere, helping people imagine that, this sort of change is possible and anchoring it in a set of values that he can talk about. Mohammed, as he'll tell you, was Rolf's bitter enemy. He was an activist in the African National Congress, lost 4 members of his family in apartheid under police detention, and yet ended up finding a way forward to sit across the table. Rolf became the Minister of Constitutional Affairs in the negotiations and was the chief negotiator in the talks to end apartheid. His counterpart on the other side was Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now president of South Africa. And then Mohammed was also deeply involved in the constitutional negotiations. And the last thing I'll say is I've worked with Rolf Mohammed and other leaders from other countries together. And after the Arab Spring, working in the Gulf and other countries, I remember Rolf specifically saying to me as an American, you need to take this work back to your home country. And sort of like canaries in a coal mine, he said, listen, we've benefited from support from the United States. So when I first came in the 80s, all my colleagues were Republicans in the United States. And then I realized it was on a bipartisan basis that Democrats and Republicans help us overcome apartheid. And he said, but, all the lessons of democracy and going from us versus them to recognizing our shared lot together is slipping away in your country. And I would say, yeah, I know we have profound problems. And then only in the last 7 or 8 years did I come to realize how really deeply polarized we've become in a way that now I think we can learn from people like from Rolf Mohammed. I say with all modesty, wearing my American hat at this moment. So with that, I think I'll just finish. And do we turn it to maybe Rolf Mohammed? And maybe I'll ask Rolf for you to start this time. I guess, okay. All right. But Mohammed, you have to promise you get very close to the microphone. Stay there. Okay.
Now, yes, good. My name's Mohammed Baba. I'm still a member of the African National Congress. The reason I'm here is not to prescribe, but I do come with a slight sense of despair. The African National Congress, in its fight against apartheid, was backed by the Soviet Union for all sorts of reasons, not necessarily ideologically. But when we decided that we want to form a new country, the country we looked up to was the United States of America. Because we thought, despite the support we may have got from the Soviet Union in the past, whether it was arms or just support in the United Nations, we thought that the only way to save our country was through a democratic system and not an autocratic system. And the lessons, many of the instruments we drew from the United States of America. Now, the reason I say this is it required a lot of convincing of our own supporters that yes, the Soviet Union did help us. But that help has gone, the Berlin Wall has gone, and whatever help there was doesn't necessarily mean it's going to help us in building a new country. And the only way we can build a new country is through a democratic system. And at that time, until now, the beacon remains the United States of America. So I must confess to you that having cajoled, convinced, and eventually we got a liberal democratic constitution. But Rolf will tell you that whatever obstacles we may have overcome, even the hatred between the two of us, we both sold the product that ended up in this liberal democratic constitution, and we still believe in it. But I must confess to you that what we saw on the 6th of January wasn't very sellable to our own people again. There's a new generation that tells us, you see, you sold this to us, now see what's happening. So I am here for selfish reasons as well, to plead to you and to realize that what you have is special. And perhaps you've taken it for granted because we know how much we had to fight for it. And we know it saved us from a civil war. We look at, Rolf and I went to the Middle East after the Arab Spring. A year ago, we were in Israel and in Palestine and wherever. I was with Tim in Istanbul meeting some Syrian refugees. And the remark we make, Rolf and I share, is that this could have been us. We could have been there, but we had the common sense and the similarity between us and you. There's very few, but there is one. Is that in South Africa, our enemy was going to stay with us. In Zimbabwe, in Nigeria, in Zambia, they were colonized. And once independence came, the colonizer went back to their mother country. But Rolf's forefathers were in our country for over 400 years. With the help of the USA, they also became pariahs of the world with lots of legislation that helped bring down apartheid. And where were they going to go to? So our enemy, who had at that time a formidable military, but had a system that was economically unsustainable, was going to remain in this country. So there were two things. One, we could fight and then leave nothing and look like Baghdad. Or we could come to our senses and say, we have this country, what can we do together? And we had to put our emotional and our impulses and all our anger behind us and realize that failure wasn't an option. And the similarity is, in fact, I think the responsibility with respect is more with you because you're the leader in the world. Democracy is in retreat. I look at what's happening in the African continent. You know what's happening in Ukraine. And if the beacon of democracy doesn't inspire the world, then that retreat is going to be even faster. We've got to recover it. And so part of it is, this is one of the reasons I'm here. I've come here to you for you to help us, because you're the reference point. Now, if that looks insurmountable, and I certainly know that you have all the fortitude and the skills to overcome that, but just a gentle reminder that Rolf and I, in the world, thought we're going to half kill each other. And it's because of his leader, F.W. de Klerk, and my leader, Nelson Mandela. It was the quality of leadership that saved us. And part of the leadership, the most difficult part, and I used to be in the executive of the ruling party, I still play a role, was to convince our own supporters and undo many of the messages we gave to them, to create the hatred and the energy to fight the apartheid system. But once we had to construct, it was a different kind of energy and a different kind of fortitude that was required. We had to go back to our people and say, I know you're poor, I know you've been oppressed for 200-300 years, whatever, but please temper your expectations. Because what Rolf and them are giving us is an excellent civil service, an excellent infrastructure. And look at the television and see what Baghdad looks like. Or look at what, well, at that time, Syria hadn't exploded yet. But look what's happening north of our country. Look what's happening in Zimbabwe. Whatever we do now, we have to do it in terms of the rule of law and in a systematic way, but it starts with forgiveness and starts with a common purpose. Now, Rolf and I would like to I'll end off on that note and then give over to Rolf. Rolf and I would like to take credit, particularly Rolf, I think. I'm a little more humble. Now, he played a much more important role. We'd like to take credit as politicians. But trust me, we didn't do it alone. In fact, more importantly, it was the faith-based organizations and civil society. We are politicians, we love power, we're seduced by it. And sometimes we only think of our own interest and our own constituency's interest. But the moral perimeters of our conduct at a time when people were killing each other were defined by the faith-based organizations. And we were blessed with Archbishop Tutu. He was able to draw many other clergy and many other faiths, whether it was Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, brought all of them together. And they defined the moral perimeters of how Rolf and I should operate. And it is with that kind of guidance, we were able to create a strong center. My political party had a lunatic fringe. They were crazy. Rolf had, as part of the apartheid government, a lunatic fringe as well, who were perfectly, and they did, both sides, perfectly capable of exercising the kind of ill discipline that resulted in death while we were talking. But by creating a strong center, having reasonable, we didn't agree on a lot of things, but what we did realize is that if we were to base our lives, or rather the center, on constitutional principles, when all else was failing north of our country, on the values of a democracy, and to ensure accountability, and most important, that people felt that they were part of a process where they could express themselves. That's what democracy was all about in the first place. Perhaps we could then create a strong center and remove the extremities within our modes, both on my side and on Rolf's side. So I thought I'll use that as a basis, as an opening, and then hand over to Rolf, whom I'm sure will do a better job, though.
Thank you, Mo, for those introductory remarks. I think you've set the scene very well, if I may say so. I grew up, my last years at high school was the start of the civil rights movement in the US. And for some reason, I, as a youngster, took interest in that from far away. Maybe it was because of the fact that I realized that we were going to have some of the same challenges somewhere in the period that would follow in South Africa. But I grew up in a very conservative background. I grew up on a farm. We didn't have real means on the farm because my father struggled. I keep on telling my black friends in South Africa, I went through high school without running water in the house and without electricity in the house on the farm. So I was exposed to that kind of experience. I never complained about it, but that is how I grew up. But after school, I had the opportunity to go to university, and I was suddenly a beneficiary of the apartheid rules. The laws that were introduced in the 1950s, in particular by the National Party government of the country through the apartheid system, made me a beneficiary. And so I was exposed to that line of thinking from a very early stage, and I kept on staying in that space, supporting apartheid for that very reason, until I started practicing as a lawyer. And that made me starting to realize what is on the law book is unjustifiable. There's no way that we can keep on with these apartheid laws because it was based on discrimination purely between black and white. We had racial segregation forever in South Africa, right from the start of the first European settlers coming there. But it was emphasized, the segregation, through the apartheid laws that was instituted from the 1950s onwards. And it was through this realization as a young lawyer that I started to realize I have to work for something different. And when I entered politics, it was with that notion. 1979, I went to Parliament. I give that background just to say that in the early days of my political awareness, the civil rights movement and so forth, there were arguments in South Africa that we can't go that way. Because people said, it's the melting pot, as it is pronounced in the US, that would be our downfall in South Africa. And that was the whole thinking behind apartheid and structural segregation. In 1982, I came to the US for the first time, and I was exposed to what was happening at that stage. It was Reagan years. But I came away with one very clear impression, and that is this is democracy in practice. I chose as a theme for my visit the question of what happened after the civil rights movement in the US. And I visited, as a result, many different places across your continent. But it gave me a good insight. And I went back to South Africa as a young politician by then, determined to say, this is what I would like to contribute towards changing in South Africa, creating a democracy that works. I had the benefit during that trip to be exposed to many persuasions, left and right, in your country. There's one meeting I will never forget, and that was at the head office, the headquarters in New York of the NAACP. You can imagine what hard time they gave me, because I was this apartheid politician from the National Party, and they questioned me left, right, and center. In fact, they didn't allow me to give any answers. So those were my sort of formative experiences in politics. And certain things stuck in my mind, and certain things I tried to help to change. The fear factor was there. Of course it was. Because by the time that I entered Parliament, we were, the white population, the white minority, were probably around 13% of the total population. And that was one of the factors why change started to happen so slow and so late, because of that fear. And it was only through pressure from outside, sanctions and pressure in different other ways, also internally, that the real change took shape by the end of the 1980s, prior to the release of Mandela at the beginning of 1990. But the context is, I think fear withheld us for a very long time to start the process of real change in South Africa. And if I can define that fear, it was fear about what would happen to the white minority, but also what would be the outcome if we start with the change. And quite frankly, at the time that Mandela was released, there was no absolute certainty as to what would the outcome be. There was a commitment from Mandela before he was released that he would start a process of dialogue and negotiations. But that was all. It was not even certain whether his compatriots in the ANC would follow that line, because they were either in prison or they were in exile. And the leadership didn't even have the time or the opportunity to really consult with each other up to that moment. So the uncertainty was contributing towards this fear. But we fortunately knew one thing, and that is that we had to move ahead. And the determining moment was, of course, the release of Mandela. In all conflict situations where Tim and I and Mohammed have been involved in the period since we resolved the South African question, I think there's one factor that played an important role in my addressing of conflict, and that is you have to find a moment of irreversibility, meaning that is the determining moment. Our moment of irreversibility was the day that Mandela was released from prison. He could never go back. So that forced us, fortunately, in the right direction. We had lots of breakdowns in the negotiations and major challenges. But all the time we knew one thing, and that was we had to move forward. And that resulted in the end in a peaceful settlement and the transfer of power from apartheid to democracy, which was also a very smooth process. Some of you were observers of that moment during the election of 1994, after which Mandela became president of South Africa. So I think the reason why people like myself maybe started to ask the question, what is happening in the US, is because we have seen some of the same determining factors in the past in our own experience. Questions about what would the future mean for us? What would the future entail? We're living in a different world. Quite frankly, when I was here in 1982 for the first time, it was a predominantly Anglo-Saxon society, the United States. That was my perception, at least. Today, the United States is far more cosmopolitan because you've inherited a lot of people that immigrated to your country. And it's a completely different composition than it was 40 years ago. And that's not going to change. In a certain way, your moment of irreversibility had already arrived. And nobody is going to change that. Nobody is going to see again the majority-minority equation like it might have been 40 years ago, as far as your society is concerned. I think those are questions that one has to address. And you have to determine the future according to those questions and the answers for that. Can I use one example to maybe in a similar way, but not exactly the same, address the point? Some years ago, we were very actively engaged in the Northern Ireland problem. Tim took me there the first time in 1995, the year after we finished our business in South Africa. And so the years that followed, I was intensely involved in the Northern Ireland problems and the solution of that, the Good Friday Agreement that came about in 1997. But prior to that, we had all the parties coming to visit South Africa. But then it took the Northern Ireland politicians a very long time to actually effectively implement the Good Friday Agreement subsequent to the settlement. And some years later, on a particular occasion, we invited all the unionist parties to South Africa. That was around about 2003, 2004. And the reason why we did it was to say, we can understand your fears, you as unionists, because we're coming from the same background. We had the same fears. But it doesn't help to escape it. You have to address it. You have to face it. And so for them, in my mind, and that is what I put to them at that stage, was the question, you have to look at the future and determine where you're going to align yourself as unionists in the north of Ireland. It's either London or Dublin. And that answer has not been defined even now, today. And it doesn't really matter. But if you now go to the north of Ireland, and Tim and I were there in April, it's an open border. There's nothing that prevents people from moving in or out from the north, or even goods and freight. So effectively, that's an open border. I use that as an example to make the point that one has to look at the future and to decide for yourself. Are you going to align yourself with that future? It's going to be definitely different from where you're coming. And let me end off by one point. We had a major breakdown in the negotiations, right in the middle of it. We thought for a moment that it's the end, that there's no progress in the negotiations. And Mandela suddenly said, I can't negotiate with you guys any longer. I don't trust you. That is what he said publicly. And for a moment, we had a complete breakdown. Then Cyril Ramaphosa phoned me, my counterpart on the ANC side, and he said, when can we talk? And we started to talk the next day, of course, with the approval of Mandela and de Klerk. And for the next 3 months, we did nothing but to talk, sitting across the table, looking each other in the eye. Some nights walking out on each other. But the next day we were back. But that was the determining moment in finding the solution. Because suddenly we had to ask ourselves, what is it that we want from the future? Instead of what is it that we want to protect from the past? And the moment that shift happened, the old paradigm was gone, and we could define the new paradigm for ourselves. Now, I would like to add to what Mohammed was saying. We are looking up to the United States of America to give guidance for democracy in the whole world. Please continue doing that. That's the plea that we're making to you. Democracy is in retreat. I was at the conference of the Rand Corporation, you know the institution very well, in May this year in Washington, D.C. And it was purely on the subject of the state of democracy in the world. And the reality is, democracy is being currently represented by around about only 80% of the world's population, and it's in retreat. We can't afford that to continue. For the sake of the world population, we can't. And countries like ours that were newcomers to the democratic scene are dependent on that we carry on. And the message that is coming out from the United States of America at the moment is not a favorable message in terms of democracy, the practicing of democracy. It's not a good message because it seems, and we hear the talks outside, that people are saying you're heading for a new civil war. I know it might be said tongue in cheek. It might not be real. But the reality is that is the type of speculation that goes around elsewhere. And the plea from our side is please avoid that. Make sure that you find your hearts in the same place as far as the future is concerned. You might differ, and that is part of democracy. Democracy gives us all the right to differ from each other and to argue and debate with each other, but not to fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. If you don't mind, if we ask some questions, all right with you? I'll go ahead and start, and then any of my colleagues or anyone else who might want to chime in, we'll just make this informal. The sort of the goal was to make this just an informal conversation where we all kind of chime in, but I'll begin. Mohammed, I was really struck by something you said early on about how your enemies were staying in the country and how you all had to sort of deprogram your own followers from sort of the rhetoric and the tonality that you had been prescribing to them for decades. So as we're sort of looking at our country right now and that heightened rhetoric and that harsh tonality, what advice do you have for us for how we can sort of undo some of the conversations that we've been having in this country that have sort of led us to this polarization?
Sorry. The tone, or rather the message that we took to our own supporters, we took it in a very humble way and not underestimating the intelligence of our constituency. Many of them were illiterate, but they were wise. They knew what to expect. They knew the pace at which things would happen. And I remember speaking to some old people in the rural areas. And I remember one lady even telling me, old lady, she gave me coffee in a gemt, and that's how poor she was. And she said, I know it's not going to come in my lifetime, but I know my children have a future in it. So I learned that never ever underestimate the intelligence of your constituency. They will understand, but speak to them. The second is understand the fear of your adversary. And I want to tell Rolf, I don't know whether he'll agree with me, but if there is a lesson from South Africa to be learned, I think one of Rolf's, his constituency's biggest fear, they were subject to a very harsh civil war themselves. The British really, I mean, many of us believe that there was a genocide committed there. Thousands of his people died, and their response was one, to ensure that they address their fear, they brought about the apartheid system. But I think, Rolf, now 30 years hence, one of their fears was that their culture will be destroyed. What happened was that their churches, their culture, their language was protected by the apartheid system. And one of the things they feared was once the apartheid system goes, where's the protection? Let me tell you what has happened. Exactly the opposite. Today, there are more Afrikaans songs being recorded. The language is at its height. In fact, the envy of many others, because we see what's coming out. Their art, all that it's largely because they knew they're not being protected and they had to invest in it and not be overconfident and take it for granted. So if there is a lesson, that would be it. I think Rolf will agree with me on that they're thriving. Their culture is really thriving. There's no threat of it going. It's strengthening all the time. The other thing that I thought was very important that assisted us. You know, as politicians, we like talking. I mean, I'm referring euphemistically in smoke-filled rooms, thinking we're solving the world's problems. But the reality is that me, in my daily life, I hated a policeman. That was the executioner. That same policeman now I'm going to need in a new South Africa, and I'm going to have to change my mindset. And that doesn't happen overnight. It requires assistance. And so the entire constitutional process and the building of democracy was not a top-down approach. It was a bottom-up approach. And it started in the streets, where we fought literally pitch battles with the police, with arms. And then suddenly, we now have to change after the 27th of April, 1994. And it's not a light switch. You can't switch it on and off. The anger, the hatred still persists. But what we did do again, the role of the faith-based organizations, civic organizations, getting policemen in the community together in the same room in a structured way, start speaking to each other, guided by the leadership with correct messages. And that was the kind of assistance we got in trying to change the minds of our own constituency. We didn't do it on our own. We needed society to do that. I thought I'll also just tell you that in the context of Africa, South America, and even in post-Soviet Union, Europe, for a country that is 30 years old, to have recalled 2 presidents, we recalled 2 presidents, and there was no bloodshed in the street, is a testimony to how the institutions of democracy protected our democracy. That was the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, the institutions of accountability. So to the credit of Rolf, I mean, I wasn't there at that level at that stage. When negotiations were taking place, we had all kinds of differences, and we expressed our hatred within 4 walls. But not once did the leaders and the leading negotiators ever in public criticize the constitution-making process and criticize democracy. The differences were expressed within the context of those democratic institutions, but behind closed doors at least. But it's our institutions that have saved us. In the last 10 years, I am embarrassed to say it, that we produced a president. 8 years he lasted. And he systematically hollowed out our institutions. We now have a president, we're trying to rebuild it. But we know that that's our saving grace. So I thought I'll just, the reason why I mentioned institutions, what comforted my own supporters and what comforted Rolf's supporters was that they could seek redress if ever there were attacks on their culture, on access to power through the institutions of democracy. So that helped calm down our own constituencies and speak to them.
Again, my name is Gerald Neal. I extend greetings to you again. This is a very interesting discussion. I almost was not going to be here, and I have to leave shortly for another engagement, but I just want to make an observation from my perspective that I think you made a very good point about your institutions saving you. I think that is, we're at the precipice of actions of our institutions operating to do what they're supposed to do. And I guess I'm just a perennial optimist. I think that at the end of the day, we will come to be a better society and our institutions will prevail, and they will save us. You made a point. You have to address your issues. You can't run away from them. And there is fear. And we have a legacy of racism and a lot of other things in this country. That's a reality that we have to deal with, but we have to face them. So we have to overcome our reactionary tendencies, and we have some. I would lay them out, but I'm not here to divide. I'm here to pull together. But we have to face them head on and not be reactionary to it. I think that's very important. I'm sure that you all face some of that same thing and probably have some of it going on right now. And the other thing that's interesting about your comments is that the future will arrive. And we have to make a decision of who and what we are. And I think fundamentally, I think there are dynamics that are in place that are doing that. But I think we're at the precipice of how that's going to play out. But me being an optimist, I think it's going to play out for the better. Having said that, I just want to make one more observation. If your leadership, picked up something else, when your leadership understands and assumes the responsibility and they have that vision and do not succumb to undermining your institutions, then you have a better chance of success in that regard. It seems like you said that your leadership took a very key and conscious role in moving from A to B to move forward. Would you comment further on that?
I think that stands out in the success story of South Africa in terms of its transition from apartheid to democracy. Our leadership on both sides were determining the future. The great thing is that we started off without conditions on either side. And it was easy to look at it from a conditional point of view. Mandela was released from prison without conditions, but he was prepared to step out without conditions. And then the leadership gave us direction all the time. There were moments where they had serious fights with each other. But the bigger good for the country was always determined. So it's absolutely a fact that South Africa would not have been where we are if it was not for the leadership of those two individuals at the top. And at one stage, de Klerk was challenged seriously by the white people. And then he decided to call a referendum with the approval of Mandela, because this was after the process already started. And he called a referendum for whites only. And he won that referendum with a 70% majority by persuading the white community to say, this is the right way. This is what we're going to do. Change is unavoidable, but also this is the direction that we're going to follow. And at the same time, Mandela had opportunities where he had to give direction to his own constituency as well. The killing, like Mohammed referred to earlier, of Chris Hani, also midway through the process, which was an assassination by a white immigrant from outside. And Mandela was the one that stepped up and said, we have to continue with the process. We have to finish what we started to do. And it was his leadership that prevented us then, at that moment, from entering serious, violent contestation between black and white. So, yes, absolutely. Leadership is a determining factor in processes of change everywhere.
My question follows very closely on the heels of that. When apartheid is taught in American schools, of course, the two names we learn are Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. And my question is, if those men had chosen a different path, if they had become other versions of themselves, do you believe that other leaders would have risen to the task and allowed South Africa to achieve its ends? Or do you think that those two men were so uniquely gifted and placed that they were inseparable from the outcome?
We were blessed. And we always asked the question, but we don't have a Nelson Mandela or a Archbishop Tutu. I mean, that's true. But Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu emerged from a certain set of circumstances. And lying latent somewhere, I'm sure in this room too, is a potential leader that can lead this state, at the very least, to a different outcome. I'm not saying it needs another outcome, but avoid a potential outcome. So I'm quite firm in my mind, because I've seen, yes, the world knows about Nelson Mandela, knows about Bishop Tutu, but there are a number of Nelson Mandelas and Bishop Tutus lurking in that society. And when the moment arises, I know that the opportunity for leadership comes in. And emerging from our own little communities, people will surprise you. It's just seizing the moment, and that moment does come.
Thank you so much.
Just comparing the United States and segregation and the fight for segregation, we did have leaders who were in political positions who were elected by the people. But from the United States standpoint, the courts also played a major role as the Supreme Court began to turn around some of the decisions that had been made previously. And I wanted to know, how much of a role did your judicial system play as our judicial system played, particularly from the Supreme Court of the United States and your highest courts that had to make those decisions during that transitional period?
I think that this was one of the best things that we agreed on right from an early stage, is that the judiciary should be independent, and that the highest court of the land should be the constitutional court that will adjudicate on the Constitution itself, only the constitutional court. We don't have that clear distinction between the separation of powers like you might have it in your system. But I think it's fair to say that the Constitutional Court, or the institution of the Constitutional Court, has saved the country so far in a very specific way from the leadership of a president that was destructive and that was on its way to destruct the country completely, like Mohammed was referring to. And by means of practical example, the politicians were hesitant to recall Zuma when he was president of South Africa. They found it difficult to come to that decision, the majority of parliament, to make that position or take that position. But it opened the opportunity for civil society and other institutions outside of politics to make appeals to the Constitutional Court. And they laid charges against Zuma as president of the country. And the Constitutional Court every time ruled in favor of those claimants that were civil society institutions. And I think it's fair to say that in the end, that forced Zuma to step aside more than anything else, because of the way in which the Constitutional Court handled the situation by adjudicating on the prescriptions of the Constitution. So I'm sitting here as a South African of a particular minority, and I can say that I feel as protected as anyone else in my country under the guidance of our Constitutional Court. And the same everybody else can say, irrespective of from which community we come and what our background is, what our history says about us, we are equally protected under the Constitutional Court. And I think that is the best safeguarding one can expect. If I can just add one point, we must remember we're coming from a paradigm according to which white people were superior and black people were inferior. That was the paradigm that prevailed for more than 300 years in our country. And we had to change that. And the new paradigm says we are all equal as individuals under the law, under the Constitution. And therefore we needed an institution that can protect that, and that is the Constitutional Court.
With your permission, I'd just like to add one more thing to this. From the ANC, you could ask me, how did we allow a president to emerge from my party? And, you know, it was infuriating to see everything we fought for. We believed in a non-sexist, non-racial society, and we had to bow for that. But somehow he took control of our party. And he brought in black nationalism, ethnicism, because he belonged to the largest tribe and he had the numbers coming with him. Everything we did not believe in, everything we fought against. And for 8 years, we were strangled by this. And I'm telling you, not on behalf of you, but on behalf of myself, I'm a politician. Utter coward. That's what I was. Scared with the weight of incumbency. And as Rolf says, you know what we politicians are. The minute the Constitutional Court took the decision, suddenly all our politicians became heroes. You see, the Constitutional Court said it. But when they weren't there, we all sat quiet like little cowards and mice. And that's the truth. It is our institutions. Many of my colleagues will tell you, oh no, we got him out. It's not the truth. Truth is the institution saved us.
And we know that the courts have made a major impact here in this country because over 100 years, the system of segregation was, it wasn't maybe, it was in effect from the time the country was established in 1776 until about the time that the civil rights movement became very strong enough to make those changes. But it was the courts that initiated those changes before the elected officials took on the charge of changing from segregation to integration. So thank you all. Thank you for your service, and thank you for coming and talking with us and relating to us what we also had to see here in America to what you all had to deal with back home in your country. So thank you again for coming, and thank you for providing us with the wisdom and the history so that we understand what has happened and what we must still continue to do to stand up for what's right when we see wrong being initiated. Thank you again.
May I just respond to that immediately? Please don't let us down. That's my plea to you. Your system took us out of trouble. Now help us sustain that. And that's my plea to you.
Thank you, Leader Graham. I want to honor the time we have. I think we would all want to stay here all day. There's some committee hearings starting at 3, which is why some of the members have left. But if you would indulge us with a few more questions, Representative Duvall had a question, and then Representative Grossberg, and then perhaps if any staff members have a question, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Mohammed, you had said that the process of healing began with forgiveness. So how do you prepare yourself for forgiveness, and how do you prepare those you lead for forgiveness?
In our case, it is the faith-based organizations that assisted. Without their assistance, and again, I say we were blessed to have the Archbishop Tutus of this world. As a human being, as fallible as I am, I don't think I had the capacity as an individual to forgive without the kind of religious and political leadership I had. They were able to take us through a process. And to give you one example, Nelson Mandela always told us, do not reduce yourself to the level of your enemy, because then your fight is not worth it. What have you been fighting for? Then it's a personal battle. And so I personally, I don't know what Rolf feels, but certainly as a human being, I knew my weaknesses and shortcomings. And if I wasn't taken through a certain process with people who are equipped to do that, with leadership and the kind of spirituality that there is, I wouldn't be able to come to terms with it. But that's not only at that level. We had to do it with all our supporters at the bottom. I'll give you one example, just one example. The person we hated most in South Africa was a black policeman. I could not stand him because I saw him as a traitor. How can you implement the white man's system to oppress me? And we started becoming brutal and violent, There were deaths that resulted in some black policemen. And Mandela got very angry. He says, can't you see he's a product of a system as well? He's got food to put on his table, and he has to carry out orders. And that's the kind of leadership that kept on guiding us. We were young, angry, violent, whatever we were. I mean, everything that's bad in a human being, that's what we were capable of. But it's with leadership that we were able to do that, both political and religious, I must say.
Thank you both for being here today. You each said something very prophetic. Rolf, you said, and I think this is almost a direct quote, that we need to ask, what do we want from the future versus what are we trying to protect from the past? And Mohammed, you spoke about how there was a fear among the white ruling class about their culture being destroyed. And the reason why I think that these two concepts are very relevant is today, in the last hour, we elected a new Speaker of the House who, not here in Kentucky, a U.S. Speaker. A speaker did emerge. And at the same time, on my way down here, I was reading an article that says that the 2024 presidential election is not going to be an election about policies. It's not going to be an election about politics. It's not going to be about economics. And I'm sure you know the famous statement that James Carville said, it's the economy, stupid. Well, this article, the name something like, it's the culture wars, stupid. And it shows a deep analysis that what's dividing us now is the very basic concept of what does it mean to be an American and what do we care about as Americans, to go so far as to not just disagree on values, but to disagree on facts. And the reason I'm bringing up the new Speaker of the House is we might, and I know in the General Assembly we do here in Kentucky, disagree on who won the 2020 election. And we have now elected someone who has openly said that he does not believe that the actual winner is seated in the presidency. And this person presumably will be overseeing the next election, which is on Twitter creating, and I know Twitter's not the real world, creating an absolute panic and crisis for the confidence one way or the other in the 2024 elections. So my long-winded rant is going to conclude with the question, how do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile the disagreement in values, which is one thing, versus now a disagreement in basic facts, like who wins an election, and come to an understanding with whatever happens per the voters in 2024, that we agree this person is the winner and this is the person who shall be seated in the White House, and not have not just a repeat of January 6th, but God forbid something 100, 1,000, or 100,000 times more deadly than that.
I really don't want to get into politics, and it's not my business to talk about US politics, really. I don't know enough. But what I do know is, as a person watching from the outside, that there's several scenarios that may emerge from a year from now. Some, hopefully, and we pray, will be good, one of the scenarios. But the other scenario was one that will divide the country. My question is, you are sitting here in Frankfurt. How is whatever the outcome and scenario that plays out there, how is it going to impact on your community here where you live? And what measures can you take from now until next year to ensure that whatever outcome there is, you have the necessary shock absorbers in your communities and in your streets to have the type of social cohesion that won't break your community apart? And that's where we live. That's where we go to school. That's where policing happens. So I'm not saying you must ignore what's happening there, but is there work to be done here on the ground to be able to, I mean, we may be in different political parties, but we go to the same churches, we go to the same supermarket. You're not going to a supermarket in Washington. And again, I don't know enough, but what I do worry about is how will it break up whatever the outcome, and we hope for the best outcome, one that's accepted. But how does it impact here at home? And what you as a state legislature can do to ensure that whatever seismic activity takes place there doesn't permeate into our communities here.
Can I, on that point, conclude with a positive message from our experience? You know, we had all the reason, even up to the last minute in South Africa, to face contestation, because it was a moment of determining change, the biggest ever in the South African history, when we had to hand over power from the apartheid government to Nelson Mandela and the newly elected government. And that contestation didn't happen. And the simple reason why it was managed in such a smooth way, the transition, was because we had a center of persuasion that looked at the future, like I said earlier. And we were led by our leaders in that, people from all communities. It was really a center that consisted of people from the ANC side, from the National Party side, and from all other parties. We had margins, sure, extremists on both ends, but the vast majority were in the middle. Not in agreement on everything, but in agreement on the values that we established in our constitution. And if I can make one appeal added to what we said earlier, is to look at the values contained in the foundations of this nation and get people to combine efforts around that, to build that center, to look at what are those values, and to make a plea to your counterparts of other political persuasions to follow suit. Mandela was very important in that regard, in building that center, because he reached out to all communities. His symbolic reconciliatory efforts, in other words, building a common establishment of the South African nation, was fundamental. And you know, like Mohammed was saying earlier, I believe in all of us there's a little Mandela. All that we need to do is to go and practice it. Do what he did, and we can all create a better world. So I think it is up to us, each of us, instead of pointing fingers, to say, what can I do? And how can we help others to come of the same belief that is the message that I think we would like to bring. Build that center and keep it strong.
Thank you all for being here. I feel like I could listen to you all day and we can learn so much more. I've learned so much today. One of the things that keeps popping up in my head, and I think Jillian has referenced it and both of you have referenced, the extremist groups that you have in society who tend to have a louder voice, although there are fewer of them. You have more moderates, but they typically aren't as loud. My question would be, during your negotiations, during this process, how do you temper that or mitigate that and allow both sides to kind of come to the middle and, sort of lessen the degree to which the extremists have some sort of influence?
Well, Mohammed must add, but one of the ways that that practically helped us to overcome these contestations, especially at the grassroots level, and there were plenty. I think we said it already. There were more killings after the release of Mandela through political violence than there was during apartheid years. In other words, between the release of Mandela and him becoming president, there was huge political violence in South Africa. And it was mainly between different black parties, or parties representing the black constituency. And the only way through which we could control this, or contain it rather, was by establishing local peace committees in different communities. And I can say this from my personal experience. When we were negotiating there at the national level, the future constitution, we could not reach out to all communities where there was violence taking place, where hard heads and extremists were fighting with each other. But it was these local peace committees, consisting of representatives from the different communities, activists, police, station commanders, and so forth, all coming together at the same table because of the existence of these peace committees. And the peace committees were led by local community leaders, in many cases religious leaders, others just social workers. And they were coming together. Whenever there was an occurrence of problems at the local level, we could expect of them to help to bring people together and reconcile them. And it worked wonderfully. It's one of the good stories about the South African case that is unfortunately not told enough in terms of its impact and the success it had. So that is one way, I think, of helping to bring people together and to minimize the role of the extremists. And fortunately, there's the role of these committees have been recently documented for the first time, actually. And if you would like us to share more information about that, we can certainly do so.
May I just add to this? What I did learn is never underestimate the value of symbolism and the optics. In politics, it's very important. Of course, what we say also is very important. So before we establish, this is in the midst of what is a brewing war taking place. I mean, thousands of people are dying. And here emerges Archbishop Tutu, calls Nelson Mandela, calls Buthelezi, calls F.W. de Klerk and says, let's get national television here. You are now going to sign a peace accord and make a commitment to peace. The impact of that, a respected religious leader calling politicians and literally binding them to peace. And then flowing from there at every little precinct, town, city, it was replicated. But it started with this optic and the symbolism of it all. that you're going to save this country and you're going to save your communities. We can't allow this to happen. But with it comes the building of trust as well, because you've got a policeman sitting there, you've got, and Rolf is right, it rescued us. I just thought, I'm just throwing a thought. What if the legislators here, or the governor, or whoever is in power, that kind of symbolism, it helps policemen with their work as well, because the pressure's off them. They're not hated anymore. They're part of the solution and not seen as part of the problem. I just thought I'll throw that.
And maybe we have to say that just repetitively. You know, the way in which Mandela reached out to other communities, how he reached out to the white minority to build trust and the belief that we can live together, that we can go forward together. The old story about him visiting the widow of the man that had put him in jail for 27 years. To have a cup of tea with her was one of his first acts after he left prison. Can you imagine how powerful that was for the white community to say, this guy is okay, we can trust him.
I cannot thank the two of you enough for being so generous with your wisdom and your time and coming to visit us here. I know you are holding a lot of these while you're here, and I'm so grateful that you are, and so grateful we all got to experience your voice today. Before we part ways, I would love if you wouldn't mind if those of us who are still here would come up front to have a photograph made before we part. Brian will generously take that for us. And if it's all right with you, gentlemen, if there's some information for contacts that I might pass along to the people who are here today. We did record this, so if anyone wants to share it with other lawmakers or people on the staff that you think would benefit from it, please do. And again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I hope the lessons you've left here today help each of us to plant seeds of light in these dark times in our own place. Thank you.